Thank you, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 31st session of Impact from Home, the last one for this year. My name is Camilla Denardis. I'm a volunteer of Net Impact Amsterdam, and I'm your host for today. So for those who don't know it, which probably most of you do, but let me briefly remind you what we do. Net Impact Amsterdam is the European hub of the global organization Net Impact, which actually has 10,000 members across 10 different countries. So we have several chapters. And at Net Impact Amsterdam, we want to create a community of impact professionals who contribute to a more sustainable society through their careers or sphere of influence. So if it sounds like you, please become a member if you aren't yet. We host several activities such as this one, as well as networking events in person when possible. And we have several programs such as our signature mentorship program, which will be starting again in January. So stay tuned. And as well as our LinkedIn page is very useful if you look for vacancies or interesting articles. So today's topic of this session is going to be about COP26, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Sandra Guzman. I actually had the pleasure to talk with Sandra already in October when I wrote a little blog article for the Net Impact Amsterdam website to kind of set up our expectations for COP26, what we should have kept our eyes for. Sandra, it's amazing that Sandra is coming back with us to discuss about what happened at COP and to kind of reflect together about the outcomes, as well as also to discuss what do these events actually mean for us, for our lives, and how we can influence such broad global events that sometimes feel like a lot is going on for 2 weeks and the 2 weeks after, and then nothing until next year, but actually I think is an ongoing process. So welcome, Sandra. How are you doing?
Thank you so much, Camila, and thank you so much, everyone, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and very happy to discuss not only the context of the COP, but as you said, how these events relate to our daily lives, because at the end of the day, this type of conferences impact how we live and how we will live in the future. So very, very happy to be here.
Thank you, Sandra. We really want to hear about that. So before we jump into the questions, actually, I want to give a little brief intro about you. For those who don't know you, you have an amazing CV. So Sandra is actually originally from Mexico and she lives in UK. She's a manager at the Climate Policy Initiative, as well as the founder of the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and Caribbean. She has a PhD from the University of York, specialized in climate policy and climate finance. And actually, she has had actual experience in climate policy as she was the climate change director of the environmental ministry in Mexico. So she has really actively been involved in negotiations, international negotiations around climate change and policy since 2006, and been at every COP since 2008. So a true COP veteran, I would say. We couldn't get a better person to talk about this than you, Sandra. And I know we talked about what was your role at the last COP in October in Glasgow. And you had sort of like a double function, you explained me, because you were there as part of the delegation from the Climate Policy Initiative, which hosted several events, as well as as a founder of the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and Caribbean. And there you were kind of trying to influence the negotiation process together with other organizations from the Global South around the climate finance topic. So but before we jump into your actual activities there at COP, I would like to first hear from you a general take on how did this COP feel for you? Was it different from previous COPs? And how do you feel about the main outcome, which was captured in the Glasgow Climate Pact?
Thank you so much. Of course, first of all, I would like to start having a reflection about what these COPs mean. So these Conference of the Parties are sessions that are celebrated every single year since 1992, when the convention was created. And why are these conferences important? Because every single year we have new information about what is happening with climate change. You know, the science is progressing very fast. So we need to discuss what is happening, what are the new discoveries, and how we are going to change our daily policies to adapt to those kinds of scientific analysis and findings. So every single year is very different. I have to say that after following this conference for a while now, I see that every single year represent a milestone in a process. Climate change is not something that, as you know, will be completely solved, but it's how the evolution of how climate change evolves depends as well as how fast we are reacting to tackle the problem. So imagine now not only the importance of having these conversations every single year, because we have to discuss what are these the new evidence that we have, but imagine now that we have to discuss these between 197 countries. It's a conversation where every single country has a voice, and that's more or less what creates the big problem, because you have 197 countries with completely different interests, with completely different visions and perspectives about what climate change is. Because, for instance, for certain countries, climate change is there, but they don't necessarily feel it like as a problem, because they are somehow prepared to those impacts. But imagine now those countries that are living the impacts of climate change in a daily basis. Somehow, most of these countries that are suffering the impacts are the poorest countries that have more difficulties to tackle the problem institutionally, economically, politically, and socially. So when you see all these countries in a table to discuss like common elements, of course, it's very, very difficult to find a ground kind of agreement. So if you think about the process, we are talking about that this process started in 1992. So we can see that it has been ongoing for a while. Why this conference was important? Let's remember that in 2015, something very important happened, was the creation of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is relevant because it's the very first time that all the countries recognize that even the most developed countries and the least developed countries, every single country has a role to play when we talk about tackling climate change. We know that historically, the developed countries are the ones that created the problem in a way, because they have been with this development that has been extracted a lot of fossil fuels, producing and emitting a lot of greenhouse gases. But of course, now the Paris Agreement was calling to the whole number of countries to contribute to stabilize the emissions and to avoid an increase of the temperature in more than 2 degrees Celsius. And ideally 1.5 degrees. And I'm going to come back to that difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees Celsius, because there is a massive difference between those two numbers. But in the Paris Agreement, there was the very first time that all countries said, okay, we all have to deal with this, we all have to reduce emissions, and we all have to adapt to the impacts of climate change. But in order to achieve the full implementation of the Paris Agreement, we had to define the rules of the Paris Agreement. So in this COP, in COP26, the aim was to complete those rules. And luckily, those rules were completed. So now this conference that happened in Glasgow was a very important milestone, because now we have the rules of the Paris Agreement, so we are ready to fully implement the Paris Agreement. Doesn't mean that in the last 5 years we were not ready to implement some parts of the Paris Agreement, because we already started implementing the Paris Agreement, but this is the time when we all have to implement and fully follow what the Paris Agreement is telling us to do. So just to let you give you an idea of what were kind of 3 key issues in this conference. And we have to think in these 3 issues as the different parts of the convention, the different key topics that we discuss every single year. So for instance, one of the main topics is mitigation. You know that mitigation are all these actions that we need to implement to reduce emissions. This is a very important track, because we know that we need to stabilize those emissions according to the convention and the Paris Agreement. This conference is, for the first time, is recognizing that we have to accelerate this stabilization of emissions, because unfortunately, the actions that the countries submitted to reduce emissions are not leading us towards the scenario of the increase of the temperature in 1.5 degrees. what is happening around the world, the commitments that countries are providing or are submitting to the convention, unfortunately, are very weak. And now we are in the track of the increase of temperature in more than 3 degrees Celsius at the atmospheric level. So let me give you an example of what does that mean. So for instance, according to the IPCC, which is this intergovernmental panel on climate change, is a group of scientific advisors from many different countries of the world. They have been analyzing and tracking what is happening with climate change from the different perspectives. And they told us this year in a report that they published that basically the activities that we are doing are not enough to stabilize emissions. But back in 2018, they published this very important report that explains the difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. Just to give you one example, in the context of 2 degrees Celsius, we would be losing 99% of the coral reefs around the world, 99% in the context of the 2 degrees Celsius. And in the context of the 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will be losing around 70%. It's not necessarily a good news. We will be losing a lot of ecosystem, but the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is massive. And that's why around the world, we have to work all together, all the countries, to stabilize emissions and avoid avoid an increase in the temperature in more than 1.5 degrees. So this was a very important element that was highlighted in this conference. Countries are still recognizing that 1.5 degrees should be the goal, and that the whole commitments from different countries should lead us towards that goal. The second very important element that happened in the mitigation context, you know that one of the biggest issues when we talk about climate change is what is causing climate change. We know that the production of fossil fuels around the world is the main source of greenhouse gases emissions. And imagine, we have been discussing this forever, but this is the very first time that there is a mention about the role of fossil fuels in the context of climate change. It's the very first time that the text says that countries should reduce the production of coal, which is a major emitter. And well, it says that it's going to be phased down, the coal production. The original text said phase out, so it's completely different between phase down and phase out. This was a major issue at the end of the conference, but the fossil fuel mentioned, the coal mention is the very first time that this happens. And it's very important to continue working towards the phase out of coal, eventually gas, which is another fossil fuel that you know is very, it's impactful. And of course, oil, that you know is a big elephant in the room. But of course, there are other good news about, for instance, adaptation. You know that for many years, we were discussing about the role of mitigation. Let's reduce emissions. But now we cannot just talk about reducing emissions. We have to talk about adapting to the impacts of climate change. And the Paris Agreement told us that it is important to work in both tracks, reducing emissions and adapting to those negative impacts. And this was one of the major discussions in this conference, how we are going to set an adaptation goal that will lead us towards that adaptation process all around the world, because this is not only about developing countries, it's also about developed countries. Developed countries are also very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So in this sense, a very important point that was a cross-cutting point was about finance. You can imagine that finance has been the core of these conversations. I can do things if I have money. And this is a major discussion. This COP was fully related to finance, a lot of elements related to finance. Some good news is that we agreed in having more money for adaptation, not only mitigation, because historically the climate finance flows to mitigation represent around 90% of the finance flows, and we need to compensate, we need to balance that. So there was an agreement to doubling adaptation finance, which is very good. There are some, although not enough yet, but it is good. There were some commitments to finance the adaptation fund, which is a very important mechanism to finance adaptation measures. And now we are discussing a new goal on climate finance, which is probably you hear in the past that there was this agreement of transferring $100 billion from developed to developing countries. which is a commitment that haven't been complied. The agreement was to transfer this money by 2020 yearly. So every single year, developed countries have to transfer 100 billions to developing countries. That hasn't been complied. And this is one of the major gaps that exist, but it's one of the key issues that we have to follow in next COPs, how we are going to comply with these 100 billions, but particularly how we are going to set a realistic goal, because today we are important, and the type of conversations that we had in this COP.
Thanks a lot, Sandra. This was quite a thorough overview of the highlights of this COP. Really exciting. As we can see, your activity were mainly around the climate finance, which was the hot topic of the conference. And indeed, I think I read your manifesto that you presented at COP, where you demanded that there would be a transformative agenda for finance climate action across countries, especially across developing countries, which needed the most, and increase the finance for climate adaptation. So it feels like we did some progress on that side. Still lots to do, but I think this was indeed one of the successful negotiations that happened at the COP26. So to stay on the topic of climate finance, there is another issue that I know we talked before, which is the one about loss and damage. So loss and damage is refers to the impacts of climate change that occur beyond the capability of societies and ecosystems to adapt. And it is quite a controversial issue. It has been quite a controversial issue as of now, because of course, countries don't agree on whose liability it is to compensate for such climate change impacts. So this was, I expect this was a rather more difficult discussion that happened at COP. So I would like to hear from you what was your take on that and what was achieved there?
Of course, I think loss and damage is one of the key conversations that also took place. And let's make the difference between what is adaptation and what is loss and damage. Adaptation is the set of measures that we have to set to adapt to the negative impacts that will come. No, it's kind of like a planning process to adapt to those negative impacts. But loss and damage refers to all those, let's say, losses that we already have because of the climate change. Because as we were saying, climate change hasn't been static. Climate change is there. While we are discussing all these issues, climate change is happening, like hurricanes, droughts, like all sort of problems related to climate change are happening every single year. So this is a discussion that came from vulnerable countries that have been commenting that impacts of climate change are there, are costing money, are causing deaths and losses in houses, ecosystems. And the key question is, who pays? Who pays for those losses that already happened? Because this is not only about planning for the future, it's something that not want to talk about compensation. They believe that if there is something that happened in the past, is done. But obviously vulnerable countries are like, well, just let me give.
I think Sandra's having a bit of a connection issue.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering whether it was mine or hers. Yeah, okay, but well, I think we lost her. Did we? Yeah, maybe. But in the meantime, as she tries to get back, I could maybe I forgot to tell everyone that they're welcome to pop in the chat their questions. And at the end, yeah, like before the end of the session, we will look at the questions, and I will invite you to maybe unmute yourself to ask the question to Sandra.
Does anyone have any questions so far that maybe we can discuss here with the group? I personally have a question. Maybe we can see if she can answer this for us later. And that's about like where this climate finance is intended to come from. how much of this is intended to come from the public domain and how much of this is intended to come from the private domain. Because obviously these two different capital types have very different expectations in terms of what that money should be able to do and achieve. Yeah, not sure if anyone has any insight to that while we wait for Sandra.
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, we also got another question from Eloisa in the chat.
Yeah, I wonder, it's linked to Andrea's question, but it's specifically about adaptation. I think this aspect of climate change is generally quite overlooked when we look at it from as a private investors. So I wonder what are her thoughts on that? How can private contribute on adaptation?
Andrea, would you be able to send the link to Sandra's phone? I'm sending you her phone so she can join from their mobile phone.
Oh yeah, sure. Just give me a minute or two.
Yes, super, thank you. Yeah, I think it is indeed very good to ask questions to Sandra around climate finance, because that's really her bread and butter of what she's been doing in these negotiations across the years. And it is becoming increasingly polarized. I was reading, for example, one of the issues that is around that is that often we finance developing countries or emerging countries through loans. This basically leads to them developing debt that they cannot pay, or that puts pressure on them, especially during the last couple of years with the COVID pandemic. They became increasingly unable to pay back this debt. So I think another important issue of the climate finance discussion is, in what form are you going to provide money to developing countries for adapting and mitigating the effects of climate change? So that's maybe something we could also discuss with Sandra once she's back.
So I've sent her the link, so let's cross our. Oh, she's back, Sandra. Hey.
Sorry. Those are the difficulties when we do this online events. I joined in my cell phone, so I hope you can hear me.
It's good to have you back. We were in the meantime, we hear you and see you really well. We were discussing some questions, and in the meantime, they were popping up in the chat. I think maybe we could start from Andrea's question, which, maybe Andrea wants to ask herself, Sandra, the question.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. My question was around where this climate finance is intended to come from. Is this all public funding? How much of it is private funding? And how do you see that? How do you see that being allocated accordingly? Because given the different expectations that are required for those different funding types.
Absolutely. This is a very important question because, for instance, when we agreed in the goal of the 100 billion back in 2009, imagine this goal that has been came from 2009, and there wasn't clear necessarily where the money could come from, but the agreement was that developed countries should transfer this money to developing countries. And there has been a lot of interpretations, because in the Paris Agreement, it says that the financial support should come from a variety of resources, public, private, and innovative sources. So the developed countries have been saying that this 100 billion and all the financial support should be, should come from all different types of sources. But for developing countries, it is very important that most of the money, or that a big chunk of the money, should come from
public resources. Why public resources? Because there is a commitment when countries commit to provide money, there is a commitment that will come or will have that support from the Congress, or it's something that is more that you can tackle, track, and that you can ensure that those money are going to come because it's public money that should be spent every single year. But we know now that climate change it's beyond, we are not going to be able to cover the whole necessities with 100 billion. That's why we are talking now about a new goal. But we know now that public money is not going to be enough. Public money is very, very important because it's a matter of changing the dynamics all across the countries to ensure that climate change is mainstream. It's mainstream in the public finance system. That's very important, and not only for developed countries, but also for developing countries. And I will give you an example why later. But I think now more than ever, the private participation is going to be important, and particularly to accelerate those solutions and innovation at the end of the day. So I think now we have to think, for instance, for the new goal, it's very important to set the rules and to establish clearly that public money should be there and should be ensure to ensure the predictability, but private money should be also part of the conversation. And the key element is how these two sources will have to interact together to maximize the effects and the impacts of the activity of the climate action. Otherwise, we are going to be losing money without having necessarily the effects that we want. And the final point in this, I would say that it's not only the amount of money that we transfer, because it's very important to ensure that transfer, but it's also a matter of the quality, where the money is allocated. We are identifying that all these resources that have been flowing, because climate finance flows are increasing around the world, but the countries that are receiving the money are not necessarily the most vulnerable. So are those that are suffering the most are not necessarily the main destination of climate finance, which is also a key issue that we have to discuss in the future.
I think on this last point, Sandra, is that I also read that indeed the highest amount of climate finance is going not to developing countries. And I was wondering whether this is due to the fact that there is increased risks associated to financing projects in developing countries. Therefore, there is less investors who want to take such risk. There is more uncertainty or a more stable situation politically, or what are the reasons that actually it's much harder to invest in developing countries around these projects?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there is a link in terms of the management of the resources. Unfortunately, there are countries that have been really are struggling to set the right institutions, the right tracking systems, the right transparency processes to ensure that all these resources are being used effectively. Of course, you can imagine that there are some countries where there are not institutions in place, but this shouldn't be the key element. I would say that one of the key elements that climate finance should do as well is to support those capacity building processes at the national level. So it's how developing countries can actually improve the way that they do stuff. For instance, how to set like the right institutional arrangements, how to set the right policies, and climate finance should be able to support that as well. So it's not only about transferring money to create a specific project, but it's transferring money to create the right capacities to manage that money. So I think it's shouldn't be, like this story of what is first, but we have to think in the parallel process. Otherwise, we will never gonna, be able to face the problem, because we will say, but because this country is suffering a lot, but doesn't have the institution, so then we are not gonna finance it. Then we are going to leave them behind because we are not able to tackle based on their needs. And this is just, let me share with you, I had the pleasure to be part of a consulting group that was working with the Standing Committee on Finance of the Convention for the last couple of years, I was working with them in that characterization of what is developing countries need. What is what they need to tackle climate change. And of course, you have all these experiences. They need capacities, they need institutions, they need policies, they need transparency systems. All these type of things are related to the implementation of projects. And sometimes developed countries do not see those needs because they believe that all countries are in the same level, but it's not true. Developed countries have a lot of experience having institutions, setting the rules, and developing countries are in a very, very different stages, particularly those least developing countries. So I think it's very important to change the mindset when we talk about climate change and effectiveness, because we cannot believe that all countries will sort this out by themselves. We have to support, we have to create, for instance, more South-South cooperation, exchanging experiences, but that should support also by developed countries who at the end of the day have the money to support those activities. And I would say that we have to think not only in the short term, but these capacities, these institutional arrangements will serve for later, for longer processes. No, so I think this it's a very, very much how we have to think about the long-term processes, how to support those long-term processes, and not only think in this short vision, but how to make transformative approaches.
Thank you, Sandra. To stay on the climate finance topic, there were actually a couple of questions from Eloisa and Serge. Maybe either of you wants to unmute themselves to ask the question, or unless you felt that Sandra already answered it before I move on.
I think it was already addressed, my question. So it's fine, thank you.
All right. How about then Andrea's question?
Yeah, just to follow up on what you have said here, Sandra. So I'm curious, like, some of these things you've just mentioned in terms of capacity building, I could see alternative methods to transferring that beyond just transferring of money. How do you see that playing a role here as well when it comes to knowledge, experience that can be transferred through expertise, for example, rather than just fixing it with money?
Yeah, exactly. I think this is a critical issue, is how we are going to actually improve the way that things are done at the national level. And this is also related to technical support. No, sometimes it's about technical support, for instance, to implement systems. For instance, in this COP, there was an agreement about Article 6 that is related to carbon markets and all these market mechanisms. And to be honest, a very little list, a very small list of countries have experience of carbon markets, because it's something that was, for instance, explored, that countries like the European Union, that Australia, that the US, like, you know, developed countries have experience in these type of things because they have been doing it for a while. And they took several years to have them in place and to understand the dynamics. And exactly that type of processes, that type of lessons learned is something that they can share with developing countries to understand how to do things, but also understanding the context of the developing countries, because it's not the same. A policy will never gonna say, it's not gonna be the same in the US or in Mexico. No, they have different processes, they have different contexts. So it's important that the technical support comes with a clear understanding about those, let's say, cultural and national characteristics. And sometimes that's why I think sometimes developed countries want to impose certain processes, certain policies to developing countries. And it's very difficult because cooperation shouldn't be conditional. Cooperation should be intentionally, directed to be able to support those type of activities. But I think definitely one of the elements in the context of the convention, it's when we talk about means of implementation, we don't talk only about finance, we talk about capacity building and technology transfer as well, because sometimes it's about having the technology, access to that technology to be able to implement a specific project. So yeah, we have to think in the different range of tools, let's say, and comprehensive packages to collaborate between countries.
Yeah. Thank you, Sandra. Yeah, I think indeed collaboration was one of the key topics at this last COP. So now to kind of space out a little and think about what's going to be next. So we know that one of the successes of this COP was probably that we agreed, parties agreed to reconvene in 2022 with updated targets. In order to achieve the carbon emission reduction that is necessary by 2030. So we have expectations that more things will happen next year before the next COP in Egypt, Sharm El-Sheikh. So what do you think is going to happen, and what should we keep our eyes on next year?
Absolutely. I think this is a critical issue. As I was saying, the whole world has to work towards this stabilization of emissions to avoid an increase of 1.5 degrees. And the only way that we can do that is increasing the ambition of the national commitment. So we have, every single country has their own national determined contributions, which is a set of activities that each of the countries are committed to do related to mitigation and adaptation in the coming years to achieve that stabilization. It is important to say that this has to happen by 2030. So by 2030, we have to reduce 45% of the global emissions, which means that all countries have to contribute. But these NDCs have to reflect that pathway, have to reflect that pathway, because to be honest, as the UNFCCC, the convention presented an analysis in the context of the COP that says that the NDCs that were provided or that were submitted to the convention are not enough, and actually are quite weak when we put it in the scenario of the 1.5 degrees. So definitely, and I invite you to be very close to the processes that are happening at the national level. So for instance, what your country is doing related to these specific NDCs targets, to what extent those targets are related or aligned to the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if not, let's do something about it, because I can tell you, I'm from Mexico. Probably you hear this story at certain point. Mexico used to be quite a leader on climate change policy. However, with the new president, this new president is completely, he wants to strengthening the fossil fuel industry. And now the targets that Mexico set are not only not enough, but instead of reducing emissions, is increasing emissions rapidly. So that type of things is something that we have to observe as citizens, as organizations, and as institutions, because if we do not increase the ambition of the NDCs, we won't be able to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, not by 2030, not by 2050. And this is going to be critical, because we are basically, in the real scenario, we are in the track towards the increase of temperature in more than 3 degrees Celsius. So the increase of ambition will be critical. And I would say that another critical issue is also related to finance again. As I was saying, it's going to be very important that developed countries transfer these resources to developing countries, but it's also very important that developing countries allocate enough resources to tackle climate change at the national level, because we know that international resources are not going to be enough. Again, I put the example of Mexico. Mexico is the second destination of climate finance in Latin America, for instance, but the country is allocated 90% of the energy budget goes towards the exploitation and production of fossil fuel. So if, like, Mexico is receiving a lot of climate finance, but it's investing all their public money in fossil fuels. So how that even makes sense? No, it's using international money to do something against climate change, but using all their money to increase the emissions doesn't make any sense. So this is the type of alignment that the Paris Agreement is talking about. The Paris Agreement says that all financial flows should be consistent with the low greenhouse gases development in the future. So every single penny, every single pound, every single peso that we will invest should be aligned towards this reduction of emissions and increase of the resilience in the coming years. And this is connected to our daily life, no? How we are going to use our money in a clever way to also contribute this to avoid further impacts.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. Maybe before we leave the floor into questions from the audience, I can ask you the last questions I had on my list, which is about indeed how does COP influence and impact our lives, and how with our lives can we impact the decisions and the process of COP?
Yeah, of course. I think it's very, very important. I heard in many occasions people that say like, why are you attending these COPs? Doesn't make any sense. These COPs are so useless. But I can tell you that these conferences, of course, are very frustrating because the level of ambition that they can reach, the agreements that they can have all together, because we were talking about the different interests that the different countries have, it's very difficult to really achieve like something that is super ambitious, because all the countries, and we are talking about also the Arab countries that are very, very, very much fueled by fossil fuels. So the level of ambition is really difficult, no, to get like that, the right level of ambition, let's say. But these conferences set the rules at the international level. But what is really important, what really matters, is how to implement those actions at the national level. And that is related not only to the action of the state, of the government, but it's also related to the action of every single citizen in that specific country. For instance, this goes from the single penny that you pay to buy X or Y product in X or Y market. We sometimes don't think about our responsibility as consumers, but if you think at the global level, the consumers are the bottom, are the base of the consumption, a sphere, a scheme. So if we do not take responsibility as consumer, it's very difficult that we will change the behavior of the companies. So for instance, again, sorry that I'm talking about Mexico, but I am very critical to what is happening in my country. For instance, Mexico is the first consumer of Coca-Cola in the whole world. And Coca-Cola in Mexico, it's using and extracting all the water sources that we have. So it's basically finishing with the fresh water that we have in Mexico. So when we as consumers are investing in that product that is having all these environmental impacts, so how can we complain about the Coca-Cola as a product if we are fueling the existence of this type of product? So it's how we are going to internalize like every single things, like investing, where we are investing, but also at the daily life. I see a lot of colleagues that talk about climate change, but they drive like a Hummer or like a big truck, or it's very difficult to tackle climate change if we do not internalize that using these like very intense transportation systems are also contributing with the problem. How we are going to face like climate change if we use like very inefficiently the energy at our house. We leave all our lights turn on, and we all use a lot of like electricity all during the day without being efficient, without disconnecting our like systems. So you may think that this is like we are talking about this again, but it's true. We have to be efficient in the way that we consume energy and water, and in the type of waste that we are producing every single year and every single day. And that's the type of responsibility that we have to include in our daily activities. And this is related to the type of policies that we want to implement at the national level. So the COP is connected with our daily lives because COP is setting the rules. But the ones that are implementing those rules or those guidance are governments, citizens, private sector, academia. And that's why we have to work together to really implement better policies. But to be able to implement those policies, we need to participate as citizens as well. So that's why every single action that we contribute in the daily life will have an impact at the international level, because we won't be able to comply with all these agreements if we do not change radically and at the in your daily life. So I definitely think that there is a massive connection, and we have to internalize those connections to be part of the change.
Thank you, Sandra. I think this is a very nice, more personal note, and I also want to add that it shouldn't be seen as a sacrifice to implement these changes in your life. I think it just should be seen as a way to rethink certain activities and the way we do things. So I think we still have time for a question. We had a question from Tim, from the audience. Do you want to maybe unmute yourself and ask it, Tim? Otherwise, I can also read it to Sandra. Okay, I'm gonna read it. So I will. So basically, this is a question about previous conversation we had. There's been some emphasis, actually, we didn't discuss this, on nature-based solutions during the COP. Do you think it would be a good idea for countries with large historic responsibility of causing climate change to pay people in biodiverse, resource-constrained countries to restore nature in order to store carbon and protect biodiversity, rather than continue extracting resources and degrade the environment, as we said? And might some of the 100 billion be spent on that? And if so, under what conditions?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for this question as well. I think this is a critical element, and it's also a very good news that we are talking about nature as part of the conversation, and it's actually quite ironically, because when we discuss nature, we discuss in nature as it would be something completely not part of our daily life when we are part of nature. No, it's quite interesting to see how nature came to the conversation when we should be putting nature in the center of the conversation right since the beginning. But well, we are finally putting nature as part of the conversation where it should be the center of the conversation. But anyway, we will get there hopefully one of these days. Definitely not nature-based solutions are going to be critical, and this is precisely one of the key elements that we have to discuss when we think about how we are going. The key reason why many countries are recruiting to leave the fossil fuel industry is because their institutions, their policies, their economies rely on it. They created institutions, they created economies that rely on fossil fuels. And the key question is how we are going to change that. What type of industries we will create, what type of institutions we will create to then transform and to completely change the way that we are doing things. And I think precisely nature-based solution is giving us the opportunity to change the framework and to say, okay, how we're going to value the protection of nature, how we're going to create jobs around the nature protection, how we're going to create institutions and policies that will help us to take care of nature as a way to have an employee as well. And let me give you this example in the Amazon in Ecuador. I had the massive opportunity to visit some communities in the Amazon in Ecuador, and for them it's very key, and it's very simple. They protect nature because they belong to nature, and in their perspectives, this is, as Camila was saying, this is not a sacrifice. It's not that they are like obligated. They live there and they protect nature. They protect the Amazon, but that doesn't mean that they don't need money. They would like to have money to be able to protect the nature better, no? To have like more access to like process certain products, but as well, I mean, to have certain infrastructure to do what they do. So when we talk about financing these type of actions, we have to think in, what type of infrastructure, but how we are going to protect those that protect nature as well, no? That the defenders, the people that is in the territory. And I think this is a critical discussion. And for me, one of the highlights of this COP is the recognition of the indigenous communities as key leaders to achieve climate action, as well as the role of youth, as well as the role of women, because we all now recognize that these patriarchal, this capitalist approach is not working, and we have to change the narrative, but we have to change the actual stakeholders that are part of the discussion. So the communities, the indigenous communities, local communities will be key, and these finance resources will have to go towards them. That, as you know, most of the climate finance is stocked at the governmental central level, and it's not going down to the local activities. So I think finance, the 100 billions, as well as the new financial goal has to be directed to those that are actually implementing action, those that are protecting the forest, those that are protecting the ecosystems, to ensure an effective implementation of climate action, and to ensure that we will be effectively tackle climate change, generally speaking.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm really glad indeed we mentioned the indigenous communities and women, as well as youth groups, which I think one of the main things we came to realize at this COP was indeed the need of having inclusive conversations around climate change and how we want to cope with this. So I really hope that next COP will take an even step more forward in including different voices. So I think we came to the end of our conversation. I don't see any more questions in the chat. I have to say I really enjoyed it, Sandra. Thank you so much for being here with us. And I hope we will continue the conversation in the future as well, and we will stay in touch.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much for your time. And of course, I just want to say something, and this is an invitation as well to all of you to rethink a little bit the sense or the meaning of happiness. For many years, we have been thinking about happiness as that material dream, as that material thing of having things to be happy. And I just invite you to reconnect and to reconsider your concept of happiness. And I invite you to connect more with nature as the one that is giving us the opportunity to be here. And I'm sure that when you reconnect, you will redefine your meaning of or the concept of happiness. And I invite you to embrace and to really implement that vision in your daily life, because I think it's the only way that we will be able to tackle this whole problem, because it's not only about what we spend, but it's what we think, and start changing our mindset if we really want to survive as a species in this planet. So thank you so much, and very, very, very happy to be here.
I think that's a great thought, Sandra, especially looking for the season, Christmas. Everybody thinks about what presents am I gonna buy. I think in the end it's all we have to reevaluate what really brings us happiness. It's probably to be with the people we love and in contact with nature. Thank you, Sandra, for this beautiful thought. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sandra. Bye, everyone. See you next time.
Bye, everyone. Have a good holiday break.